Wellesley-Weston Lifetime Learning offers non-credit courses to seniors in the greater Boston area. For more information about WWLL and links to our videos, please go to www.llcourses.org.
We wanted to welcome you today, and our speaker will be Phyllis Mays, who will be describing state legislation as it affects immigrants in the current Beacon Hill session. Phyllis was a resident of Wellesley for 40 years, and she now lives in Needham and is active in two immigrant support groups, the Needham Area Immigration and Justice Task Force and the Justice and Peace Committee at St. Joseph Parish. Now, she's a point person for state legislation affecting immigrations for the task force. And as such, she attends State House hearings on relevant legislation under consideration in the current session and lobbies our state members and our state rep. And I wanted to say a couple things. One is that Phyllis didn't want to decide on the handout for you until very recently because she wanted to make sure that you had all the current information about what's going on in Beacon Hill. And I couldn't sit down without telling you that this woman is such a model for all of us. Not only does she keep her mind active, but she keeps her body active. And she still runs 5Ks. And I understand that she thinks it's really important for us to get out and walk. So if you have any questions, ask her about that too. Really look forward to hearing you.
Thank you, Anne. I'm very happy to be here because I think current events are very important, and particularly the state legislation. So the goal of my talk today is to get some or all of you to jump on the bandwagon and advocate with your state legislatures for these bills that I'm going to describe. Okay? So I'll just quickly summarize the ones I'm going to talk about, and then I'll start with the Safe Community Acts. The Safe Community Act has been introduced in both the House and the Senate. I ran copies of the entire text off, and they're exactly alike. Okay, they're being considered by the Homeland Security and Public Safety committees at the State House. A second group of bills is called the In-State Tuition Bill. And there are 4 of them, and the main difference between one of them is that it calls for immediate action. It's got a preamble. It says once it's passed, it goes into effect immediately. It would give in-state tuition to undocumented students, and I'll describe the requirements they have to have. And the other version of it doesn't go into effect immediately if it's passed. So that's in-state tuition for undocumented students. The third group of laws refer to the Department of Corrections, State Department of Corrections, and there are 2 bills. The sponsor is Antonio Cabral, and those bills, the House and the Senate version, have advanced right to the Ways and Means Committee. There are 17 steps in passing a bill on Beacon Hill, and this one is at the 17th step, so it's very likely that it will be passed in this session. And you probably know, because you're up on current events, that this is the 190th session of the General Court. That's a 2-year session on Beacon Hill, and this is the first year. So we have also 2018 to work on these bills. There are a couple of Indians, this is a joke, sitting on Plymouth Rock and watching the ships come in. So one Indian says, "Here come the ships." The other Indian says, "Oh no, the immigrants are coming." Okay. There's one other issue that has already passed on Beacon Hill about the budget. It's not a bill, it's part of the budget, but we are very happy about it. Governor Baker had tried to cut $850,000 out of ESL and basic learning programs, and the House voted 122 to 32 to restore that cut, and the Senate voted 30 to 6 to restore it. So we now have in the budget $28 million toward ESL classes, you know, English as a second language, and basic learning classes. So even though that's not a bill, it's part of the budget that passed. So I just want to applaud the state legislators who voted for that. Okay, so the Safe Community Act, if it passes, affects all of us, not just immigrants, okay? Because we have many mixed families in Massachusetts. What do I mean by that? Families with a parent who is undocumented and therefore subject to deportation, and kids who are born in the United States that are citizens. So that's called a mixed family. We have many of them in Massachusetts. So we will be affected because our communities would be made safer if the Safe Community Act passes. Now, between 8 and 10 cities and towns in Massachusetts have passed their own version of the Safe Community Act, but we need to make it statewide, okay? Mayor Walsh in Boston has passed the Safe Community Acts for Boston. The mayor of Somerville has, and Cambridge, but not all 351 municipalities have passed it, and they won't. So by making it a state law, it would give protection to all of the municipalities in Massachusetts, not just the few that have already passed their own version. And if I have time at the end, I'm not sure, I'll talk about the Newton City Ordinance that passed, because I found that very interesting. I know there are a lot of people from Newton here. So right now, under the federal law, without the Safe Community Acts, law enforcement agencies in Massachusetts can help the federal immigration authorities. I'll be talking about ICE, which is a federal agency, Immigration and Custom Enforcement. I know you can't see this, but that's what ICE stands for. The other federal agency that is involved in Massachusetts is the Department of Homeland Security, DHS, okay? So right now, it's a voluntary cooperation with ICE, but law enforcement in Massachusetts can participate in what we call a detainer, okay? So let me tell you what law enforcement in Massachusetts includes and then what a detainer is. Law enforcement would be your local police department, the state police, court offices, and sheriffs. Those are considered law enforcement offices in Massachusetts. A detainer is a request, a voluntary request from ICE to hold to the law enforcement offices that I just defined, to hold a person in custody even after they're able to be released. Now, there's a difference between a civil offense and a criminal offense throughout our country. ICE can require law enforcement to hold people who are guilty of a criminal offense, a felony. But it's voluntary to ask law enforcement to hold a person who's guilty of a misdemeanor, which is less than a felony. I'll give you a few examples. If you run a red light, that's a misdemeanor. You can be arrested and you have to go to court, but it's not a felony, okay? The trouble with the current situation regarding felonies is that ICE can go back 20 or 30 years to an undocumented person who had an offense when they were 18 years old, but they're in their 50s now. They've been living in the United States, married, children who are probably citizens. They're paying taxes. They're obeying the law, but ICE can go back to when they did shoplifting at the age of 18 or drugs or something at the age of 18 and require them to be detained. If someone is detained, they're kept by the law enforcement officers past their release date. And then ICE interviews them and picks them up and sends them to a detention center. Currently, ICE is using the Suffolk County Jail in Boston as a detention center. There are regular criminals in the Suffolk County Jail, but there are also people being held on detainers for deportation in the Suffolk County Jail. And the federal government pays the Suffolk County Jail and other detention centers $90 a day for each person, $90 per head. So they're making money, okay? I'm told that the detainees are separated from the regular criminal prisoners. I haven't verified that, but that's what I'm told, okay? So there are other detention centers throughout the United States, but the one that's used in Massachusetts is the Suffolk County Jail, okay? So then ICE interviews them. Now the problem with interviewing them is that the person doesn't wear a shirt that says ICE on it. So the person that's in the detention center, someone from ICE walks in, a man typically, and starts asking them questions. They don't know that person is from ICE, okay? They don't know that they have the right to refuse to be interviewed, which they do, because under our Constitution we have the 4th and 5th and 10th Amendments, which require due process. They also may not know English very well, so they might not even understand what they're being asked, okay? So these are all problems that the passage of the Safe Community Act would correct. So the Massachusetts Public Health Association wrote a letter to the state saying that they really need to pass this Safe Community Acts, because right now, when a doctor or a physician assistant has a patient coming in for health care, they don't know whether, say the person was beat up by their partner. They have to ask where that person lives, because if they live in Boston, they can refer them, because the Safe Community Act that Walsh passed it is in effect. But if they live in another town that didn't pass one, they're afraid to refer them to the police for investigation into the domestic assault. I've had interactions with 4 different undocumented immigrants over my lifetime, and I'm not going to go into their individual stories. Each has a different story. But domestic assault is a common occurrence, and you probably read about it in the paper all the time. And yet, if the person has a mixed family, which I explained, an undocumented adult and citizen kids, they're afraid to call 911 for help, because they figure the law enforcement will come in and find out that there are people in that apartment who are not documented, okay? And also, some of these ICE people aren't very well trained. Last year, an ICE interviewer in Massachusetts said to this man, "Where were you born?" He said, "Puerto Rico." He said, "Good, get in my car, I'm taking you to the airport," and he gave him a one-way ticket to Puerto Rico. Now, with Maria, we know that Puerto Rico is part of the United States, a territory. And that man was born in Puerto Rico, was a citizen, but he didn't know enough to explain it, okay? It was later straightened out, but that's the kind of thing that happens, okay? And so the Massachusetts Public Health Association wants this bill passed so that all the municipalities will be protected when they have a patient that comes in with a problem. And the other thing the Health Association said Dr. Portman wrote this letter to the state saying that when she has patients come in, sometimes they're afraid because they are undocumented or they have kids who are citizens, but they're undocumented. So sometimes they don't come for their appointments because it might be a public health agency and they're afraid they're going to be reported to ICE. Some kids are afraid to even go to school. Okay, and then some who do go to school are afraid that when they come home, their parents won't be there, or the family will be broken up because the parent who's undocumented will have been arrested and taken away. I went to the hearing on this act. You know, all bills that come to the State House, they have to have a hearing, right? I went to the hearing in June, and this Brian Rosa, he was a middle school student from Cambridge. He was 12 years old. He testified at the hearing because he and his sister are citizens, but their mother isn't. And he said he's afraid that he's going to come home someday and his mother will have been deported and his 3-year-old sister won't even remember her mother. Now this was from a very brave and courageous 12-year-old, I thought, that testified at that hearing. Okay, there's a case that came up in court in Massachusetts, in the First Circuit Court, the Massachusetts Supreme Judicial Court, Commonwealth versus Lunn, July 2017. It held that law enforcement and courts lacked legal authority to hold someone for civil immigration violations. Being in this country without documentation is illegal, but it's a civil offense, not a criminal offense. So this was a very important decision, Commonwealth versus Lunn. Lunn was a teenager. I think he was about 18 or 19, and he stole a loaf of bread from a homeless person. So he was charged with larceny, okay? So it went before he was detained and turned over to ICE. So it went before the Massachusetts Supreme Judicial Court, and they ruled that law enforcement had no right to hold him beyond his release date. And what happened is the charges were dropped because the witness never showed up. So he was not, in the end, he was not charged with larceny, but he was held and ICE took him. But once the court ruled that, they had to release him. And the other court case, which was in 2015, Morales versus Chadbourne, the First Circuit Court of Appeal, that includes Massachusetts and other areas too, held that holding someone otherwise eligible for release constitute a second offense, arrest without probable cause. Okay, so that is another court case that helps us to realize that we need this Safe Community Act. The Department of Homeland Security, which is a federal agency, okay, has 3 contracts with the Massachusetts Department of Corrections. It's called a 287G, okay? There are 3 in effect now, and passing the Safe Community Act would negate them. Let me tell you about those contracts. One contract is with the sheriff of Bristol County, Thomas Hodgkin. You probably have read about him. He's the one that wants to take his inmates down to Texas and help build the border wall. You read about that, maybe? The second contract is with the sheriff of Plymouth County. And the third contract is with the whole State Department of Corrections. What these contracts allow, they allow Department of Homeland Security, a federal agency, to deputize the guards and the other officers that work in these county jails as ICE officials. In other words, the officer at Bristol County Jail can go in and interview these inmates about their immigration status, and then when they're released from their sentence, they get turned over to ICE under the present situation. So the Safe Community Acts would negate these contracts. And 2 of the laws that Antonio Cabral has introduced, one would prevent the sheriffs from sending people in Massachusetts out of state to do work. Example, build the border wall. And the second one would require, if they do work for ICE as officers of the county jail, that they be reimbursed by the federal government and that records be kept and reported. So that is also a provision in the Safe Community Acts. Okay, so the two Safe Community Acts, the House and the Senate, have 91 sponsors. Now, the whole state legislature consists of 200 members, so that's almost half. And Cynthia Cream is one of the sponsors, and Alice Peisch is a sponsor, one of the 91 sponsors, okay? But Senator Ross has not sponsored the bill, and he represents some of the precincts in Wellesley, as well as half of them in Needham. He's opposed to the Safe Community Act, okay? So he's one of the people, if he represents you, or even if he doesn't represent you, that would be a source that we need to advocate for. We need to talk to him, to Senator Richard Ross, about the advantages of the Safe Community Act. But as far as your other two state senators, Cream and Peisch, they're already on board with it, but you can still talk to them and congratulate them on being on board with the Safe Community Act. Okay, I'll just take make a few comments about our United States Constitution. The 4th, 5th, and 10th Amendments come into play, okay? The 4th Amendment says you can't have undue search and seizure, and the 5th and 10th, the 5th and 14th, I'm sorry, not the 10th, require due process. So right now, the way the situation is in Massachusetts, there's no due process. ICE can pick up undocumented people who have no criminal offense, okay? And they've actually done this. I have the figures from the last 2 years. They call this ICE enforcement and removal operations. So in fiscal year 2016, 104 non-criminal undocumented people were deported. This past year, and we're not done with a year yet, it went up from 104 to 335 undocumented people with no criminal offense were deported. So that's, and many of them, as I said, have lived here for a long time, are married, have jobs, pay taxes. They are not able to to get any benefits, but their Social Security is taken out of their wages, but they don't get any benefits from Social Security because they're undocumented. So I'd like to go into the other two categories of bills now. I already explained the ones about the jails, the Department of Corrections, so I want to go into the ones that talk about in-state tuition. Right now, if you're undocumented and you apply for college to a state college or university, you have to pay out-of-state tuition. In Massachusetts, that's twice what in-state tuition is. So most of these kids can't afford that, so they don't. So passing the in-state tuition bills would allow undocumented students who meet 4 criteria to pay in-state tuition. It's not a freebie, they don't get in free. But first of all, it applies to 9 of the state universities and community college. It does not apply to the medical school or the law school. It just apply, but it does apply to UMass Boston and the local Mass Bay, and so there are 9 of them. They have to meet 4 criteria if they want to pay in-state tuition. First of all, they have to be accepted, so they have to be pretty good students, right? Because they got to get accepted at one of these 9 community colleges or universities. Second, they have to have been in a Massachusetts high school, public or private, for 3 years or more. We don't want people coming in and going to high school for 1 or 2 years just to get the in-state tuition. Okay, so that's the second requirement. They have to have been in a Massachusetts high school for 3 or more years, or they can have the equivalent of GED. The third requirement is if they're male, they have to register for selective service. In the bill it says if required, which would be just guys, right? And then the fourth requirement is they have to promise that they will be applying for citizenship within the next 180 days or have already applied for citizenship. Okay, now it can be a long path, it can be 7 to 10 years, but that's in the bill if it passes for in-state tuition. Okay, and it hasn't moved along. It's still at the first step of the 17 steps, but they have had a hearing for it. Okay, now the 2 bills that Cabral has introduced that apply to the jails and prisons, that has moved, those 2 bills have moved along, one House and one Senate. They're now at the very last step before a vote. They're in Senate Ways and Means Committee, so they've been voted upon and to advance, so they're at the very last step. So there's a good chance that will pass. Once not a guarantee, but once it's in Ways and Means, it can be then voted upon. Now, it's a 2-year session, but Jamie Eldridge, who's sponsoring the Safe Community Act, I was at a meeting with him last week, and he said that this session of the General Court hopes to have everything voted on by November and then sent to Governor Baker for signature probably by March of 2018. Now that's his estimate, it's not guaranteed or anything, okay? But that's what he thinks. So we're probably not going to wait too long to find out what's happening. Now there's another bill that we do not support. It's Governor Baker's bill. I don't know if you've heard it, but he filed it on August 1st of this year and has not had a hearing yet, but it will have a hearing, and it would counteract most of the things that are in the Safe Community Act. It's Bill House 3870. Okay, and it would allow law enforcement, I described what the law enforcement involves earlier, upon receipt of a written request from ICE to enforce the detention of that person past their release date, okay? So he does say it should be a person who's been convicted of a serious crime, but he doesn't define a serious crime. Actually, the Safe Community Act doesn't define it either. It may have to be amended to define what a serious crime is, because just saying a felony isn't enough. They plan to define it, and his bill doesn't define it either. It says domestic violence, sexual abuse, trafficking, things like that. But anyway, when his bill is scheduled for a hearing, we'll see what happens. Okay, now, I notice some people from Newton are here. Okay, on February 1st of this year, the Newton City Council passed a welcoming city ordinance. I don't know if you people have read about that in Newton. Okay, it passed 16-1 in the Newton City Council, but there were 7 people who didn't show up or didn't vote. I'm not sure which, okay? But that would counteract some of Governor Baker's bill, okay? It says, there are 5 sections that I wrote down about it. It says the court, in Massachusetts court cases I mentioned to you, has stated that the law simply does not allow police to hold people on detainers, okay? It said the Newton ordinance is consistent with the Lund decision, okay? There's no valid Massachusetts arrest authority, and the Newton ordinance requires that any arrest on an ICE detainer be consistent with the 4th Amendment of the United States Constitution and Article 14 of the Massachusetts Constitution. Fourthly, the Newton ordinance purpose is to reaffirm the city's commitment to fair treatment for all, and to make all residents, workers, and visitors feel safe. And the last one that I wrote down about the Newton Ordinance, it seeks to disentangle Newton from federal immigration enforcement. It prohibits the city from investigating, arresting, or detaining a person based solely on immigration status. That's fine for Newton and Cambridge and Somerville and Boston, but it needs to be statewide, not just those few communities. So that's why we need the Safe Community Act. Okay, so what can you do? That's what I want to talk about now. There are several things you can do. Among your handouts, you have a sheet called Call, right? In your handouts, and that gives you the contact information for state officials and for the Wellesley officials. So what can we do to advocate for these bills? You need to contact your state legislators, your state Senate and House presidents, and the committee chairs. Okay, there's 4 or 5 ways you can contact them. You can call them on the numbers I gave you on the call sheet. And if you're from another community, you can call your town or city hall and find out the contact information for the people, for the legislators that represent Weston or any other communities that are here. You can write them a letter. You can email them. That's the best way, to email them. Okay? You can visit them in person. Now, Senator Ross in Needham has office hours once a month at the Senior Center. Does he in Wellesley? I don't know. But he does in Needham anyway. And I've gone to his office hours, and the article in the Needham paper says he wants to know ahead of time what topic you want, but I don't tell him ahead of time what I'm going to talk about. Sometimes he doesn't show up in person. He might send his legislative aide, right? But still, it's a contact. And when I have met with him in person, he says even if 2 people call him about a bill, he thinks that represents some other people, more than 2 people, if he gets 2 calls. And I think all the legislators feel that way. If they get 2 calls or 3 emails, there are more people behind that didn't call and didn't email. So it's very effective to do that. Okay? A second thing you can do besides contacting your legislators, you can write letters to the editor, to the Wellesley Townsman or whatever paper. Newton has a tab, right, which accepts letters to the editor. You can tell your family and friends who live in Massachusetts that might live in other communities about these bills and urge them to support them in their communities. You can go to the State House hearings. As I said, I went to the one in June on the Safe Community Act. You don't have to speak, but just showing up, you'll get both points of view. When I went to the one on the Safe Community Acts in June, most of the people who spoke were in favor of it, but there were 3 sheriffs, and I knew they were sheriffs because they had shirts on that said they were sheriffs, who spoke against the bill, but they were a minority. So you don't necessarily have to speak at the hearing. It's not required. If you do, you have to sign a sheet that you want to talk, and they're giving you like 3 minutes to talk. There's one other thing that happens at Beacon Hill that I've found is helpful. It's called Lobby Day, and MIRA, and I'll show you what MIRA stands for. MIRA holds lobby days. They announce ahead of time it's going to be a certain date, usually say Wednesday from 12 to 1, and they urge constituents to go to Beacon Hill that day and visit the office of their representative and senators, okay? The representative and senator might not be there, but the offices are open at Beacon Hill, and you can talk to whoever's there representing the senator and representative about the bill that you want to support. And it does take a little time because you got to go into Boston. I take the T, but and then you got to search for the office for your state rep or your state senator. But it's very effective, and we've gone to Ross's. I've gone on Labor Day to Ross's office, and there've been 30 or 35 people there, not all from Needham, but speaking about the Safe Community Acts. And sometimes we don't even have enough chairs to sit down in the office. There are so many people there, so that's very effective. And there's one last thing I want to urge you to do in the last 4 or 5 minutes, and that is to log on to the Mirror site. I don't know, and you can't read it, but it's the Massachusetts Immigration and Refugee Advocacy, MIRA, and then this isn't in the name of the agency, but it's the coalition. And download a copy of Know Your Rights. I'm going to I have 3 copies here. I'll pass them around, but what I did, I downloaded it from Mira, and I made 6 copies so it fit on one sheet of 8.5 by 11 paper, and then I cut it up. And I gave these to my undocumented immigrants acquaintances. They are in English, but you can also download a Spanish version. Okay, so I'll pass these around. I would like them back. But this is, if you know undocumented people, download this and give it to them, okay? It says, if you are stopped by immigration or the police, hand this card to the officer and remain silent, okay? The card explains that you are exercising your right to refuse to answer any questions until you have talked with a lawyer. And then below that it says, to whom it may concern, please be informed. Again, you don't talk, you just hand this to the person, the officer that's trying to arrest you. Please be informed that I am choosing to exercise my right to remain silent and my right to refuse to answer your question. If I am detained, I request to contact an attorney immediately. I am also exercising my right to refuse to sign anything until I consult with my attorney. Thank you. So I'll pass these around. I would like them back, please. Now, as far as the attorney goes, and this is the last thing I'm going to say, if you are arrested for a criminal offense, the United States Constitution gives you the right to an attorney even if you can't afford it. But when you're arrested for a civil offense, which being in the country without documents is a civil offense, you will not be supplied an attorney unless you pay for the attorney. But what you can do is you can find out ahead of time where you can find a pro bono attorney. And even if you haven't been stopped, write down the name of the agency so that when you are able to, you or your family can call and try to see if you can get a pro bono attorney. Thank you for your attention.
I know we have a number of questions, so I'm going to come up and get the microphone. Okay. Yes.
Phyllis, do you have approximate number of undocumented Massachusetts immigrants who have been deported this year under Trump compared to, say, a year with Obama?
It's called the Boston Area of Responsibility. It includes all of New England, though, even though it says Boston. So in fiscal year 2016, there were 104 non-criminal deportations, people put on airplanes and sent home to wherever they were born. But this year, when the year isn't up yet, that's the unfortunate part. So far, we've had 335 deportations of non-criminals, up from 104 last year. Is that what you were looking for? Yeah. But this isn't just Massachusetts, because the Boston Area Responsibility includes all of New England. And ICE has arrested 3 times as many non-criminals so far this year than it did in all of last year. Is that what you're asking? But I can't limit it to just Massachusetts because it includes all of New England.
Those numbers are New England.
Yes. It's from ICE, by the way. These figures are from ICE.
Is DWI a felony?
Is what?
Is DWI a felony?
No.
It's not a felony.
No.
Also,
It's a misdemeanor.
it's
You
a
can be
misdemeanor.
arrested and have to show up in court and pay a fine and maybe lose your license depending on how many DWIs you've had.
Also, when you talk about the Constitution, two things. One is the Constitution is protecting U.S. citizens, not
No, it protects all residents of the United States.
all residents. Okay. And also, have you ever asked Richard Ross why he is against the bill?
When I did ask him at on a meeting at the Needham Senior Center, he said he hadn't made up his mind, but he did tell me an interesting story. I'll share it with you briefly. He was having work done in his garage at his home, and a worker fell and was seriously injured. So Senator Ross said, "I'll take you to the hospital." The worker said, "No, I don't want to go to the hospital." He was undocumented. That kind of thing happens. I know 2 other cases of Brazilian workers. This is really tragic. Francisco Rodriguez is still in the Suffolk County Jail as far as I know. He was working and he fell off the roof. He was working for a contractor and he fell off the roof. The contractor did not have workman's comp, at least not that day. So Francisco has a wife and 3 kids, and since he's been put in Suffolk County in detention, his wife had another child. She can't work, she's minding the kids. So we've been collecting volunteer contributions to help her with expenses. But the point is, that contractor should have covered all his workers, but some contractors are immoral, and they know their workers are undocumented, and they know they can't say anything to them if they underpay them. This is not a current law. Well, it actually is a law, but not one I covered today. They're underpaid or not paid at all because if they complain, the employer will turn them over to ICE. And what happened to Francisco is his employer called him up and said, "I will give you some help. Come to my office on Sunday." So he's in, crutches. He comes on Sunday. Who's in the office beside the employer? The ICE agent. So that's why he's in Suffolk County Jail.
On that bill regarding the prisons, whatever it is, that's 287A. So these are people that are prisoners who have committed felonies, and then ICE wants to take them over. Is that what you said?
When their sentence is out, when
Yeah.
they're ready to be released,
Yeah.
ICE will take them over
And deport them?
and detain them.
Well, I personally don't see any problem in that. These are people who have committed felonies. Why would we want them here?
They may or may not be in for felonies.
Well, I mean, people in prison, you have to commit some serious stuff to go to prison because the prisons are full.
Now, if you don't show up for your hearing, and you don't pay your fine for drunk driving, you can be put in prison. You didn't do a criminal offense, but you didn't pay. That's throughout the United States. You
Many
can't pay.
people that are DWI kill people too.
But, well, that bill is actually well advanced. It's in Senate Ways and Means. There are 2 bills, one to compensate and one to prevent inmates from being sent out of the state.
I wondered if you would share the advantages of having Massachusetts pass the SAFE.
The main advantage, Anne, is that instead of these 8 or 10 municipalities like Boston, Cambridge, Somerville, and Newton, that it would be statewide. It would apply to all 351 municipalities. So as I said, Dr. Portman, when she's dealing with a patient, right now, if the patient's a victim of domestic violence, she can't automatically say, go to your police department and report your abuser. She has to find out where they live first. So if they lived in Boston or Cambridge, she would send them into the police because they have their own version of safe communities. But she has to ask that, and the same is true of other physicians. So that letter that she wrote was very revealing, I thought. because it doesn't apply statewide. And if you pass the Safe Community Acts, it would apply statewide.
Question about the measure to provide for in-state tuition, these people. Problem that I encountered when I was a delegate to the Democratic Convention last summer in Worcester is we have people going around asking for signatures and petitions to get these things on the platform.
Get it up closer to the mic.
People trying to get signatures to get these things on the party platform. Problem that I had, and some others did, is when you've got issues that involve expenditure, the people advocating these things should present an estimated price tag on these things, because this is something that I found impossible to vote on, something that you don't know what it's going to cost. And it should be not simply in dollars. And you did cite a figure about something earlier, and the problem with that is also it's not proportional in the sense that I don't know what that number represents. Is that big? Is that small? Just say, 20 million something. You've got to put it in perspective of overall, not necessarily the state budget, but that particular department. So I find it impossible to vote for anything or favor anything or advocate to my representative any issue that I don't know what it will mean in terms of the state's expenditures.
It's not going to cost the state a penny. It's a question of allowing the undocumented students who meet those 4 criteria that I described to pay in-state tuition, half of out-of-state tuition. Most of them can't afford the out-of-state tuition, so they don't go to school, okay, to advanced higher degrees. But so it's not going to cost the state a penny. They're going to be paying in-state tuition. So I don't see that it's a question of how much it's going to cost. That particular bill won't cost you a penny, but they estimate about 200 students a year would be able to take advantage of it. Now, most of them would be DACA. You know what DACA is? Jerry Robnick probably talked to you about DACA. Most of them would be DACA students, but there would be some who aren't DACA students also that would qualify under those 4 conditions, but they're going to end up paying the tuition. It's just half of what your kid would pay. And they can't afford double tuition.
You mentioned the uniformed sheriffs at the meeting that were opposed to this. Could you tell us what was their opposition?
They think it would let criminals stay in the country.
And this applies to sheriffs only, of all the law enforcement agencies, sheriffs for some reason.
They were the only ones who opposed the Safe Community Act when I went to the hearing in June. The other people who spoke were all in favor of it. Now, I didn't tell you, but State Senator Ross is on the Joint Committee for Public Safety and Homeland Security, but he wasn't there. He had other obligations, I was told. So their objection, the sheriff's objection, is that they feel that criminals would be allowed to stay in Massachusetts.
Yes, I actually have 2 questions. One is, anybody who has ever checked criminal records for prospective employees working with children or the elderly, you're not just looking for convicted felons. You're looking for patterns of charges. And I think that is a very, very telling thing, so that 3 DWIs is a very important thing to see on a record. I think you have to be looking for a pattern of the individual. And that's number 1. Number 2, when it gets to DACA, those are unaccompanied undocumented students, correct?
They have to be a DACA, you have to have entered the country under the age of 16, been in the country 5 years or more, right. And you don't get citizenship, but you get a working card.
I understand. All right.
So you can work or go to school.
Students that would like to educate, that makes sense. And they're to get a discount on the colleges, I understand that.
It's not a discount,
But,
they're
half tuition, they're being recognized as being legal.
Yes.
All right, that's what they're being recognized as. But who is paying for the other part of the tuition? They aren't working with Social Security numbers, correct?
Correct.
Well, who's paying anything?
Well, they're paying their own tuition.
They're unaccompanied, is that correct?
Yes, but if they've been in the country 5 years or more, they've gone to school because all...
Right, so who's going to pay the part of the tuition that they would be ordinarily responsible for?
Nobody, they can't afford that, so they don't go to school right now.
Okay.
We're only guaranteed K through 12.
Okay, that's the main answer, thank you. But I do think the pattern of charges is very important, whether there's a conviction or not.
Yeah, your point about abuse is well taken.
All right, I wondered if you would just finish up by telling us what you think it's important for us to do.
The most important thing you can do if you agree with the Safe Community Act is to contact your legislators. The call tells you some of the contact information for legislators, but if you live somewhere else, what you do, you call your town hall or your city hall, and you ask, who is my state senator, who is my state rep, and get the contact information from the town or city hall, and then call them or otherwise contact them. Face-to-face is best, but even a phone call, the person answering the phone, which is usually an intern or a legislative aide, counts the number of calls in support or in opposition to a certain bill. So that's the most important thing, to contact your state legislators. And you all have that list, call.
Well, we